My name is Martin Hamilton, as I said earlier, for those of you that joined just before the hour, Director of Leeds Civic Trust, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. I'm going to hand straight over to Richard Butterfield, who is the Director of Operations and Development for Leeds City Parish. Of course, the parish normally hosts these lectures physically. This year that's not possible, but they still are nonetheless hosting and indeed chairing today's lecture. So, Richard, could I hand over to you and you can take things further? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, and welcome to the lectures again, everybody. Really fantastic to join with you. Even though we can't meet in person, we are able to meet together over the wonders that Zoom has provided for us during lockdown. And again, we've got a fantastic turnout today. So yeah, we're on the 333 attendees at the moment. So that's really terrific. Welcome back. We're really proud of our connection with the Leeds Civic Trust, and we've been hosting these lectures variously at Leeds Minster and Holy Trinity Church on Boar Lane. But it's great to continue that link, even though we can't actually meet personally. Just 1 or 2 items of housekeeping. The lecture will be lasting for about 45 minutes. I'm assured that Kevin has it beautifully timed, timetabled and prepared for us. That will leave us with about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So if you would like to use the chat function that we've got on Zoom, by all means, add questions or comments. We won't address any of those until the end of the lecture, but by all means, add your comments at the side as we go on. Now, I think we all know now that, Kevin Grady has become something of an institution with this lecture programme. Kevin was the director of the Leeds Civic Trust for many years, and in retirement he's continued to provide this service of sharing the depth of his research, knowledge and insight all about the history of Leeds in this series. It's now in its 2nd decade, and it's a great tribute to Kevin that he's kept all of that going. And also the fan base, I think, really says it all, doesn't it? That people really want to find out more about the city and really appreciate Kevin's work, style and delivery. Now, last week in our first lecture, Kevin focused on Leeds as an industrial centre, and he talked about those great industrialists who set up textile mills and were really pioneers with technological innovation, with steam power and so on. Well, Leeds isn't just a history book of the Industrial Revolution from the point of view of manufacture. Leeds is also a great centre for commerce as well. And really from the 13th century onwards, Leeds has been a place where markets have met. And that really leads on to the theme for today's lecture, because alongside the industrial development of Leeds was the commercial development of Leeds. And this is a fascinating story in its own right, not just for the story itself, but also the way that the facilities that were needed for commerce had such a huge impact on the townscape and latterly cityscape of Leeds. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Kevin has to say about that. So really it's a theme of markets and market forces that are going to drive the lecture today. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Kevin, to start the lecture for us.
Right, yes. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that nice introduction. And it's really so pleasing that so many people who have attended the lectures in the past. Here's a little image of how we looked in 2008 when we were crammed into Holy Trinity Church. But today's lecture, I almost wanted to call it What Happened Next, because of course many of you will have heard me talking about market halls and marketplaces over the years. It's a subject which I got really interested in, and some of you will remember, of course, that when these lectures are delivered in person, I've always liked to sort of more or less give the audience homework, and I've handed out reading lists. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of context to the study of this subject. So I started commenced my interest in market buildings and marketplaces when I did the research for my thesis on the public buildings of Georgian Leeds and the West Riding 50 years ago. The first article that I had published on the subject of markets was in the Thoresby Society in 1976, when I talked about the Leeds market mania in the 1820s. Then in 1980, I sort of extended the period a bit and wrote a chapter for Derek Fraser's History of Modern Leeds. Then, of course, in the 1980s, there was a battle over the future of Kyrgate Market. And when that was won, Stephen Burt and I wrote a book called A History of Kyrgate Market, which was published in 1992, which actually is here, which I gather there are still copies of this book at the Civic Trust. And if people want copies, I'm sure Martin Hamilton would facilitate the supply of them. I then got interested in a topic which is not suitable for vegetarians, that is Leeds butchers, slaughterhouses and cattle markets. And the result of that was published in Northern History in the year 2000. And then, of course, there was the issue of the Leeds cloth halls, and particularly the future of the first white cloth hall in Kyrgate. And in order to foster the campaign for that building to be saved and renovated, in 2016, just 5 years ago, Stephen Burt and I wrote A History of Kyrgate, which of course featured greatly on the story of the cloth hall. Well, as many of you know, I have lectured extensively, but primarily I focused on the Georgian period. And for all those buildings, apart from Kyrgate Market, I haven't extended the story into what happened to them in the Victorian period and to the present day. And equally, there are various buildings which I've never talked about, which are the exchanges of Leeds. Well, I thought that this lecture would remedy this omission. So it's a lecture from earlier on in the Leeds in Your Lunch Hour series, but really rather greatly altered. Lockdown has presented the opportunity to rummage through my filing cabinets. I've been collecting material for many years about all sorts of buildings in Leeds. So I've been able to rummage through my filing cabinets and find all sorts of interesting material which I've collected. Now today's lecture is rather like a reversion to some of those very early lectures that I gave, which in fact it's really a slideshow with commentary, and there are a lot of slides, and let me warn you that if you blink you might miss some of them. I've set my timer for 30 minutes. I've got 45 minutes, so when my timer goes I know I've got 15 minutes left, so we'll see how we get on. So, Leeds markets in the 18th century. As we saw last week, in the 18th century, the town of Leeds population grew fivefold from 6,000 to 30,000. And until the 1780s and 90s, most of the people of Leeds were housed by infilling within the confines of the existing town. In that period, with the exception of the cloth market, which was moved into purpose-built cloth halls, the market for all manner of produce, livestock, merchandise, etc., remained in the open air in the town streets. Brigade, as we see here, remained the central marketplace, and in practice nothing much had changed since Thoresby's day, other than that the street markets got bigger and spread into adjacent streets. It's important to appreciate that Leeds market served a much greater population than the area that it was encompassed by the borough. Leeds was the marketing centre for the West Riding's woolen cloth, and so literally thousands of West Riding clothiers came into Leeds on market days, wanting to buy food and household goods and all sorts of things after they'd sold their cloth in the street market. Moreover, Leeds was important as a wholesale market centre. Goods and foodstuffs were carried up and down the Arun Calder navigation and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, and Leeds effectively became a funnel through which goods from the east and north ridings in particular and other parts of the country were fed from Leeds out into the West Riding. By the beginning of the 1820s, the inadequacy of the town's markets accommodation had reached a crisis point. The population had rocketed by another 60%, almost to 50,000, and the population of the borough had jumped to 84,000. From contemporary newspaper reports, it's clear that the most influential townsmen wanted to take the market stalls off Brigade and place them in a large covered market, which would accommodate both the market stalls and the butcher's shambles. They wanted to find a site for the cattle market as well, which was in Vicar Lane, and the wholesale fruit and vegetable market too. But the problem was that there was no agreement amongst them as to where this large new covered market and cattle market should be sited. So astonishingly, amidst the frenzy and mania of the building boom of Leeds in the mid-1820s, instead of one large covered market being built, in actual fact, 5 smaller markets were created. And significantly, 4 of the 5 were financed by private enterprise. Well, the first market to be built was known as the South Market, which we see here, which was built just south of Leeds Bridge, between Hunslet Lane and on the other side, Hunslet Lane and Meadow Lane on the other side. Now, this was a general retail market with shops, stalls, slaughterhouses, and dwellings. And you should note in particular here that there is this semicircular group of stalls, and then in the middle there is this wonderful stone rotunda which had fountains on either side. This will become significant as we go along. The next market building to be built, in fact, was the Bazaar and Shambles, which opened in 1825. This was built between Brigade and Vicar Lane on the line, our line just north of where today's King Edward Street is positioned. It had 60 shops, 50 of which were occupied by butchers, plus a fish market, plus a bazaar, which was on the first floor of the building. And on the right, we see an example of a bazaar, you know, where fancy goods were sold to ladies, millinery and all sorts of things. So this is one of the bazaars in London, and we must imagine that inside, on the upper tier of our Bazaar and Shambles, it looked something like this. The third new building to be erected was the Central Market, which we see here on Duncan Street, which was opened in 1827. It was a general retail market with shops, stalls, and a bazaar on its balcony. The fourth building to be erected, and it is an amazing sequence of buildings, was the Corn Exchange, which was opened in 1828. This was at the top of Brigade. Incidentally, this building on the right is still there. It's now the Samsung phone shop, but it was built actually slightly north of the hedgerow, but looked down Brigade and was rather reminiscent of the Leeds Moot Hall. This comprised the Corn Exchange itself, the trading area, some warehouses, 4 large shops, some offices, a hotel and tavern. We're actually only seeing one half of the building here, the rest projected to the left-hand side. The important thing to remember about all this is that none of the market buildings was large enough to contain the stalls on Brigade, and so the Brigade Street Market continued. No one was keen on leaving a prime spot on Brigade, and because of this, the Brigade Market still flourished, and the South Market was actually a failure. It never traded successfully. The fifth project, and one which will receive quite a lot of attention in the lecture today, was the free market. Now, until its reform in 1835, Leeds Corporation had virtually no money, it didn't levy rates, and it had no powers to regulate the town. Instead, it was the Leeds Improvement Commission, which was set up by Act of Parliament in 1755, which regulated the streets and pavements and provided street lighting. When the leading townsmen decided that the wholesale fruit and vegetable market must be moved out of Brigade and the cattle market must be moved out of Vicar Lane, it was decided by the improvement commissioners that they should look around for a suitable piece of land, and their eyes lighted on the Vicar's Field, Vicar's Croft, which we see here, which lay on one side with Vicar Lane and on the other with Kyrgate on the south side. In 1825, an informal arrangement was made with the vicar, and thereby the two markets moved into what was the Vicar's Field, and the story of Kyrgate Market had begun. In 1826, the Improvement Commissioners formally bought the Vicar's Croft and the vicarage from the patrons of Leeds Parish Church, and the vicar moved to the salubrious and excellent house at 6 Park Place. Initially, the wholesale markets were on Vicar's Croft. They were free from tolls, and it was thus known as the free market, as we see on this plan. Now, because I've extended this lecture to go beyond simple market halls and to include exchange buildings, there is another building which I must mention. The Leeds Commercial Buildings was built at the junction of Boar Lane on the right and Park Row on the left, and was opened in 1829. Now, this was an absolutely magnificent building, as you can see. It was the most expensive building in Leeds, and it was described in its time as the most elegant, the most splendid, and the most classical structure in Leeds. It was a merchants' exchange, a place where men of business could meet to transact business between 12 noon and 2 o'clock every day, including Saturdays. It was financed by a company of shareholders. Now, just to say, it had a very impressive circular newsroom, and at the top here, we see the crowned dome, which sat over that exchange room. The exchange room was a magnificent circular saloon, 36 feet in diameter, with a grand staircase and the dome 60 feet high. Well, of course, this isn't it. The building also included this newsroom and also a coffee room, a dining room, meeting rooms, and a hotel. I mean, you just look at the quality of this building, so beautiful. The light coming into the newsroom from Boar Lane on the right-hand side. And don't we regret that this building didn't survive to the present day? Well, now we move into new territory for me. This is one of the new buildings, which I've never talked about before. The most striking project of the 1840s was the establishment and building of the Leeds Stock Exchange. It stood on Albion Place. You see the central columns as the main entrance on Albion Place, with Albion Street running along its side. In 1836, there were only 2 share brokers in Leeds, but as a result of the glut of railway promotions in what economic historians refer to as the Great Railway Mania in the 1840s, the number of share brokers in Leeds had reached over 100 by 1846. As a result, in December 1844, the Stock Exchange Association was formed in Leeds and opened for business in January 1845. This institution was rather more status conscious than its counterparts in other parts of the country, and in 1846-47 it erected this very, very impressive premises on Albion Place at a cost of £12,500. Leeds was for long the only provincial stock exchange which had erected its own purpose-built building. And here I'm showing you a shot just so you can see where the building is sited, because it's often difficult to work out where it is. It stood on the site which later was built on to create the YMCA in the early 20th century. So here we have Albion Place, there is Albion Street, and then just there is where, until very recently, the Austin Reed men's tailoring shop was. At the time the building was erected, it was intended that the rooms on the ground floor should be used as a clubhouse, but that plan was never carried out. And so part of the building was later let, as we see in this advert, to the high-class drapers, Messrs. Denby & Co., and known as the Exchange Rooms. That had its entrance on Albion Street, while the share brokers continued to go in through the main entrance on Albion Place to their exchange room upstairs. But the building did, from time to time, serve social functions. And here we have this wonderful view of the exchange room. And it's very difficult to find internal views of many of these buildings. So if people come up with them or have ideas, please do let me know. On the 30th of August, 1856, a splendid banquet was held in the Stock Exchange Hall in honour of James Thomas Brudenell, 7th Earl of Cardigan. He had inherited the title in 1837, and at the same time he also inherited the extensive family estates, which from our point of view are important because he thereby became Lord of the Manor of Headingley and actually owned half of Headingley Township. But in this case he was being honoured for his heroic leadership of the notorious Charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in the Crimea in 1854. He'd become a national hero and was cheered and feted wherever he went. This dinner was for men, but some women were allowed in, and you can see them just sort of crowded at the back of the room, viewing their husbands and brothers, presumably, enjoying their dinner. It was said that women wept when they heard the Earl of Cardigan speak. Well, let's move on now to the building of Kyrgate Market, the market hall, that is. Leeds grew at a phenomenal rate in the 1820s and 30s, and by the 1840s, it was believed that the market accommodation in Leeds was totally inadequate, and indeed some of the worst in the country. In 1835, Leeds Corporation was reformed and became a popularly elected body for the first time. In 1842, it took over the powers of the Improvement Commissioners and became responsible for the free market, which we see here. Its Markets Committee immediately decided to enlarge the market by purchasing adjoining land, and with the bonus that in doing so, it bought up some of the insanitary housing on the right-hand side, as we see here, which it was able to demolish, including the notorious boot and shoe yard. But Leeds shoppers were becoming more sophisticated and complained about the paucity of covered market accommodation. Seeing a commercial opportunity in 1853, the central market proprietors applied to Parliament for an act to incorporate their company and to greatly enlarge the market. Well, the council were very, very upset about this. It felt that it was its role to provide and run the markets of the town. It successfully opposed the bill, but the parliamentary committee that examined it said that unless the council did something to remedy the lack of covered market accommodation in the town, and very fast, if the central market proprietors made a second application to extend their market, they would get parliamentary approval. Well, the council reacted quite swiftly to this situation. It did two things. In the first place, it opened the Smithfield cattle market on this site between North Street and Camp Road, today known as Lovell Park Road. This removed the cattle market from Kyrgate market, or the free market, and created space for the erection of a covered market. And of course, if you come out of town, go up North Street, you'll see what we now know as Lovell Park on the left-hand side, which is directly opposite this building, which was the Cattle Market Hotel originally. The second thing the council did in 1853 was to vote £14,000 to erect a market hall on the Kyrgate site. Well, the council were determined that their new building would be state of the art. In today's terms, we would say they wanted to erect an iconic building, and they didn't have to try too hard to think of an exemplar. No doubt in 1851, all the councillors had been to see the great exhibition at the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. And so they instructed the borough engineer, Mr. Tilney, to take advice from Sir Joseph Paxton, the Duke of Devonshire's leading gardener, who had designed the Crystal Palace, and asked him to design something similar for Kyrgate Market. And in the bottom right there, we see a picture of the market looking pristine, an engraving, and gives some impression of how fine it would have looked when it was first opened. Here it is shortly before it was demolished, looking rather dirty, but let's not worry about that. Fentman's Guide to Leeds of 1858 said, "The building is of iron and glass, covering an area of 4,000 square yards, and is situated at the junction of Vicar Lane and Kyrgate. The style of the building is Gothic." Well, time doesn't permit me to give a detailed structural comparison of the Crystal Palace and Kyrgate Market, but in everything but scale, they were very similar. This wonderful illustration of the foreign exhibits section of the Crystal Palace is striking for its cast iron lattice girders and trusses and columns, its balcony, its lightness and airiness, and the richness of its colour. And here we see the interior of Kyrgate Market soon after it was opened. And just imagine how wonderful this image would have looked had it been in colour. Fentman in 1858 said, describing the interior of the market, said, "It has 44 convenient shops on the outside and 35 inside, where there are 4 rows of iron stalls. At night, this beautiful crystal market hall is well illuminated by 200 gas lights arranged around handsome cast iron pillars. Altogether, it is the most complete structure of its kind in England." Well, with the opening of this building, the street market in Brigade closed in 1857, and the benches and stalls, goods and wares were removed from it forever. because I gave a lecture last year in the Leeds in Your Lunch Hour series about the history of the Corn Exchange, I want to only deal with it very briefly today, because I want to use the time for talking about new things. In brief, the old Leeds Corn Exchange, as it became at the top of Brigade, I mean, this is a wonderful view of it, became totally inadequate for the town's needs. And in 1861, Cuthbert Broderick was selected as architect through a competition held by Leeds Corporation, and he was asked to superintend the erection of what is perhaps the country's most splendid and finest corn exchange, which opened in 1863. This is Broderick's watercolour painting of the interior of the corn exchange, which will look very familiar to you, no doubt, which he submitted as part of his competition entry. The building, of course, is still with us today, and I'll say a little more about that as we go on. But we now move on to two new Victorian buildings. The first of them is the Fourth White Cloth Hall. In spite of the gradual decline of business in the cloth halls in the early Victorian period, when the North Eastern Railway viaduct sliced through the third White Cloth Hall in the Coals in 1868, the trustees of the White Cloth Hall nevertheless decided that they should receive compensation and that they would replace the Coals Cloth Hall with one in King Street. And of course, here it is, looking rather impressive, really quite extensive. And it was provided, as we see, in particular, with a very ornate bell tower. We will return to the hall and its bell tower later in the lecture. But we now turn to one of the new buildings that I wanted to talk about, and one which I never discussed before. Surprisingly, in 1871, the wonderful commercial buildings were sold and demolished. Surprising, of course, because it was only 43 years old at this time. And as this picture shows, a really very early photograph, it appears to have been in pretty good condition at the time. And as we said, it was a great loss to us today. The building was purchased by the Leeds New Exchange and Newsroom Company, a company which proposed to put a very similar building in terms of its function on the site, and that building was known as the Royal Exchange. Seemingly, the commercial buildings had got in the way of a Leeds Corporation road widening scheme. Indeed, as the author of the brochure celebrating the opening of the new Royal Exchange put it, had the new thoroughfare, that is the extension of Boar Lane into what now is City Square, had the new thoroughfare been constructed in a straight line, not only would a noble street have been made, but the town would not have lost one of its finest ornaments. Well, here is the Royal Exchange. The first stone of the building was laid amidst much grand ceremonial by Queen Victoria's third son, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, in September 1872. Contemporary descriptions noted that its tower, surmounted by a spire, rose to 118 feet to the finial and contained a clock. In the angle of the building, next to Park Row, there was a turret surmounted by a conical roof. The architects of the building were T, H and F Healy of Bradford. No doubt the Leeds architects were a bit upset that they didn't get the contract to design the building. The building was very fine inside. As I've said, I don't have any photographs of the interior of the building. Hopefully, you know, when lockdown is over, they may become available. But if you know of any, do let me know. The building was fine inside. We must imagine something in the style of the present Central Library and Tiled Hall, or perhaps the Bradford Wool Exchange, in terms of the luxuriant detail and ornamental quality of the interior. The Exchange itself was a circular apartment 60 feet in diameter in the centre of the block. An arcade of 12 stone and brick arches surrounded the room, which supported by pillars with carved columns and corbels, and from them sprang the ornamental iron trusses for the support of a pitch pine roof and the dome. On the same level was the large newsroom, which must have been very impressive, with windows which were enriched with stained glass, emblazoning the arms of all the major Yorkshire towns. It also had a very splendid fireplace, and incidentally, the tiled dado of that room was designed by Messrs. Moore and Co., who recently have been commemorated by Leeds Civic Trust blue plaques. Also on the floor, there were rooms for the Royal Exchange Club, and downstairs there was a fine first-class restaurant, plus a ladies' dining room and some other private dining rooms. What I particularly like about this building is its harking back to the Middle Ages and the Tudor period, something that Colonel Harding, who had designed or commissioned City Square, would much approved of. A tracery parapet was carried along the whole front of the building, and on it, although you can hardly make them out in this view, were statues of King Athelstan, Ilbert de Lacy, Maurice Paynell, Sir John Savile, and John Harrison. Rather more prominent on either side of the main entrance, there were life-size statues of, well, on the left was Christopher Columbus holding a sextant, and I'm not entirely sure who the person on the right was. It's not described, or there are mistakes in what people have written about it. So if you know, can work out who this man was, do let me know. At the 4-lane West Bar end of the building, there was a statue, which we see here, of the famous Tudor merchant Sir Thomas Gresham, who founded the Royal Exchange in London in 1565. And at the other end of the building, on Park Row, next to Mill Hill Chapel, there was a statue of Sir Walter Raleigh, which we see here, holding his book, The History of the World. But what I really like on this facade are the large carved stone panels. The first one, which we see here, is the mythical storming of Leeds Castle. Now, the projectors of the building knew that the building stood on the edge of the former moat of Leeds Manor House, but they were not aware that Ralph Thoresby had got mixed up with Leeds Castle, Kent, when he asserted that there had been a siege of the castle on the Leeds Manor House site in the Middle Ages. Pity that wasn't the case in certain ways, but it's fantastic to see how they envisaged it and how it would look. Secondly, there was a plaque on the right-hand side of the entrance showing the holding of Leeds Cloth Market on Leeds Bridge in the 17th century. I'd love to have better photographs of these if they're available. But all in all, the Royal Exchange created a fantastic backdrop for City Square when the square was completed in 1903. Well, we move back to Kyrgate Market. As the population of Leeds grew and the demand for more extensive and improved market facilities continued to grow, in 1875 the council decided to extend Leeds Market behind the Market Hall and create what they called Leeds New Market. In 1875, more land was acquired to the south and east of the market, and this large complex of buildings shown on this plan were erected. It comprised the block shops, which we know today, and an open square, and then a wholesale and retail fish market. Now, this drawing envisages what they would look like. And what you have to appreciate with this is that in effect, the market hall, not shown here, the 1857 market hall stood there, and then these blocks of shops were put in. Now, these survived the fire of 1975, so that although now roofed in, the area we see in the bottom right-hand corner is where Game Row is still there today, so the block shops are recognisable. Then there was an open square behind them, and then the fish market beyond. And here we see a Victorian photograph showing the back of the 1857 market hall on the left, a carriageway, and then the commencement of the block shops on the right-hand side. And then going to the other end, in the engraving, here we see the open square with the market going full tilt, and the east end of the block shops running up to, although we can't see it, the 1857 Kyrgate Market Hall. Of course, shopping out in the open and the rain wasn't very pleasing to the people of Leeds. And so in the 1890s, it was decided that the whole lot should be roofed over, as we see in this view. And here we see the open market square roofed over, and just on the top of the image, we can see the end of the block shops, which of course, as I say, are familiar to us today. It's wonderful to see this image because we forget what this looked like before the Great Fire. In addition, in 1899, the council decided that there should be a public abattoir and wholesale meat market. The shambles just off Brigade, the bazaar and shambles were demolished, and this wonderful looking building was erected. I didn't come to Leeds until 1969, so I never saw this building. But of course, New York Street runs across the front of this, and today it's the site of the multi-storey market car park and the bus station or coach station. I now move on to the building of the present Kyrgate Market Hall. In 1893, Leeds became a city, and in the 1890s, there was again a great building boom extending into the Edwardian period, which I'm describing in my final lecture. The council were concerned about the dilapidated state of the buildings east of Brigade on the east side, and so they decided that they should also, because they were concerned about the very dilapidated state of this building, the 1857 Market Hall, that they should demolish it, they should widen Vicar Lane, and they should put up a new building. And here it is. Basically, it was designed by the architects who designed, Leeming and Leeming, who designed the Leeds Halifax Market Hall. And it had, of course, a very fine interior. Well, I could talk to you at length about the wonderful opening ceremony and how all the mayors of all the West Yorkshire towns were invited just to show them how wonderful Leeds Market Hall was. It's a great tale, but I need to move on. In conclusion, what I want to do is to say, well, what happened to all these buildings? So in a quick whiz through, we're going to look briefly at what happened to the market halls and exchanges in the 20th century. Well, first of all, the South Market, and noting its wonderful feature, this rotunda in the middle and these semicircular stalls. Basically, the South Market had never been successful as a retail market, but it did find success in the 1820s, the later 1820s and beyond, as the site for the Leeds quarterly leather fairs. Wonderfully, Stephen Burt discovered this picture in the Thoresby Society collection, then this picture uncatalogued, which shows it's from the Graphic magazine of 1872, and it shows the rotunda of the South Market, now the Leeds Leather Market, operating, and we see all the traders in leather and leather being weighed and of course sold. In fact, Leeds became famous in the 19th century for all its tanneries, and it produced a huge quantity of boots and shoes, and this leather market was described as the largest leather market outside London. Shortly before 1879, the courtyard of the South Market, or now the Leather Market, the courtyard between the central rotunda and the semicircle of stalls was actually roofed over, as we see here. In 1902, the Leather Market left this building and went to the Corn Exchange, and the building survived in various uses, including being a warehouse. And in fact, it was only in 1960, I say only, it seems quite recent to me, in 1960 it was purchased by the Leeds City Council and demolished for road improvements. As far as the Bazaar and Shambles was concerned, it survived into the 1890s, but was in a very insanitary and dilapidated condition. The building was bought by the corporation and then sold on to Leeds Estates Company. And on this plan, showing the Shambles there in the middle, I've put on the line showing, first of all, where the county arcade was built, running through Wood Street, and where Queen Victoria Street, now roofed over as part with its wonderful stained glass canopy, where Queen Victoria Street ran straight through where the Bazaar and Shambles had been. And of course, here is the wonderful Leeds Estates Company development, which was, amongst the highest quality and class of shopping to be found anywhere in the country. In fact, it was sort of rather like, the Trinity Centre of its day, or maybe Victoria Gate. As far as the Central Market was concerned, it traded through the Victorian period. It was bought by the City Council or the Corporation in 1868 and became subsidiary to Kyrgate Market. However, half of the building was let off. We're looking down Central Road here to Duncan Street. Half of the building was let off to Ellins and Son, who were high-quality provision merchants who dealt particularly in importing cheese of all sorts from America and the continent. Unfortunately, in 1896, the Central Market caught fire and was very, very badly damaged. Here we see, of course, the Duncan Street frontage. And inside, this is a wonderful view. It's the only picture I've ever seen of the interior of the Central Market, but you can see it was a real mess. Effectively, it was gutted and it was demolished shortly afterwards. And there it is still. Looking down, you see a juxtaposition of it with the Corn Exchange. As for the Stock Exchange, in 1875, the share brokers left the original building for a new home, and their new home was a Georgian house on Albion Street, just across the road from where the original building had been. That's where the Austin Reed's building, YMCA building, was, just across the road. And this view shows it in 1927 as the Stock Exchange. Oh, I should just say, if you look back, you can see the Venetian window in effect there, and here we see the share brokers operating in that building, having a relaxed chat in the 1960s. In fact, the Stock Exchange remained open until 1873, when, along with all the provincial stock exchanges in the country, it closed down. Today, that building has been replaced by West Riding House, the ugliest building in Leeds city centre, which was erected in 1976. As for the fourth White Cloth Hall, it was never really fully used, and by the 1880s, a large part of it was let to the Post Office and the Inland Revenue. In 1895, it was sold to the promoters of the new Metropole Hotel in King Street, which opened in June 1899. Now, of course, in Yorkshire, we don't like to waste money, do we? Even if it interferes with aesthetic taste. And no doubt to the horror of the architects, the proprietors insisted that the fine bell tower from the cloth hall should be plonked on top of what was otherwise a very elegant looking, entirely terracotta hotel. As far as the Royal Exchange is concerned, it lost its exchange function in 1907 when a replacement exchange was opened in Brigade, part of the Grand Central Hotel. It suffered the indignity of becoming the Tatler Cinema, in part of it at any rate, and in its basement it had Yeats's Wine Lodge, albeit dignified by having a Wurlitzer organ. In the 1960s, it was in poor condition. There was a big gale in 1962, and the spire, I suppose, or the snuffer, as it was described on top of the tower, had to be removed because of the damage. In 1966, the building was demolished and replaced by the high-rise office block Royal Exchange House, which of course is still there today. But it was converted a few years ago to become the Park Plaza Hotel. Well, the Corn Exchange, of course, survived. The market traders, the corn dealers, still traded there in the 1980s, but its future looked bleak. What could it be used for? Fortunately, in the early 1990s, specialty shops saw the potential and converted the building into a really superb shopping centre. It's had varied fortunes over the years since then, but it was acquired by Rush Bond about 6 or 7 years ago, and they hope to give it a bright future. A good piece of news is that the immediate environment of the Corn Exchange is to be dramatically improved by the City Council's scheme for pedestrianising the area around the Corn Exchange, extending pavements, limiting traffic, etc. Kyrgate Market itself, of course, experienced the terrible fire in 1975. On the 13th of December 1975, 2/3 of the building was destroyed by fire, and what a mess it was. What could happen? Well, in the short term, the council decided that it would provide temporary sheds. One of these two, which we see here, was erected in 1976, and the second one, I think the one on the left, was erected in 1989. Well, these were intended to be temporary. What was going to happen? The situation was that MAB, the development company, came up with a scheme in the 1980s to effectively demolish, turn the market into a shopping centre, only really retaining the Edwardian frontage or main building as the entrance to the shopping centre with escalators. Leeds Civic Trust fought off that scheme at public inquiry, and happily the market was wonderfully refurbished by the Norwich Union, who owned the building. What its future is today, of course, is a moot point. But I want to finish now simply by looking at one other building, not a Victorian one. Much of the story of the 19th century market halls and exchanges in the 20th century has been about them being demolished. But the past 2 years in the 21st century has produced the very welcome story of the renovation and part rebuilding of the city's very first market hall. The first white cloth hall, which was erected in Kyrgate in 1710. After almost a decade of campaigning by Leeds Civic Trust and several missteps, finally, the renovation and reconstruction of the building began about 2 years ago, and this was the scheme for which got planning permission. The project was taken on by the city's best developer of historic buildings, Jonathan Maud and Rushbond PLC, and with the financial support of the Heritage Lottery, Historic England and the City Council, the scheme has been able to proceed, and it has proceeded through lockdown. This is a picture taken just before Christmas, showing the work at the back of the building. And I'm delighted to say that the cupola or bell tower, which the Civic Trust and I were very, very keen should be replaced, was actually put in place. And here is the front of the building. This was taken only last week by Cliff Stead, and it shows the building with its windows now installed. The right wing of the building, of course, is entirely new, a reconstruction. And we see the windows in there, but also work going on to install the glass canopy, which will go over the courtyard. This is a tremendous thing, and it's pleasing to be able to finish by saying that the most important historic building in Leeds, in my view, is finally being renovated, and no doubt I see it's snowing outside at the moment here quite heavily, but when the snow goes away and we're out of lockdown, you'll be able to go down and see this building and monitor its progress. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for another fascinating talk. That's been really absolutely fabulous. Lots and lots of interest from people in the chat. Clearly, lots and lots of people wanted to stay for the discussion part as well at the end. It's amazing, isn't it? So many innovative buildings that were built for as exchanges, market halls, and so on. So many innovative building styles and constructional styles, but sadly, so many lost either by accident or willfulness on the part of the authorities. So you know, quite a body of buildings that were lost there. Also in the chat, clearly that lots of memories that people have of those buildings as well, many of which weren't actually finally lost until you know, the last few decades. So certainly it struck a chord across the board there. In terms of some specific points that have been raised, I think what comes out here from many people that the greatest tragedy has been the loss of that wonderful Royal Exchange building.
Yes.
And certainly some interesting comments about the freezers and the statues there. Two particular questions. One was, Mark Sturdy noted that the West Bar stone was either incorporated or replicated within the structure of the building. And Joyce Hill was speculating whether perhaps the mystery figure might have been Sir Francis Drake.
Ah, well now, yes, that's an interesting one. It's possibility. I think that the figure is depicted sort of holding a piece of cloth, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but yes, Sir Francis Drake certainly would have been a great candidate. And well, yes, you think, well, if they had to choose between Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, which would they go for? So that may well be the case. But when I looked up about this, and there was in one of the Thoresby Society publications, there was a description of the statues, one of which had claimed that the figure on the right was Sir Walter Raleigh, and I thought, well, when you looked at the statue on the far left next to Mill Hill Chapel, you thought, well, that's unmistakably Sir Walter Raleigh. So I don't know, but no doubt if I finally get the time. I mean, one of the issues, of course, in the present lockdown is that, you know, sort of people like me and Stephen who are working away writing books and giving lectures, effectively we're left with the resources that we have in our houses. I mean, there's a certain amount of online material, but in effect there are certain facts that you can't check up easily. But one of the great things is there are online newspapers, and if I'd had the time, I should have delved into you know, the period the Royal Exchange was open to see what they said. So I'm sure the answer will appear.
Well, maybe one of our attendees will take that upon themselves to find the mystery of the mystery figure on the Royal Exchange building. Were any of those statues saved, or any of the freezers saved to your?
Well, that's the interesting thing, that the statues I think were given to Leeds City Museum. And I do remember, I think probably when I was up at Temple Newsome, seeing, a couple of very weathered statues sort of almost in a hut somewhere. So I think that some of them will exist probably, in the museum collection somewhere. I think they were pretty badly weathered, but it would be exciting to be able to relocate them again, and hopefully somebody will write in and say, yes, I saw them at Temple Newsome or somewhere, within the last few months. I should just say, interestingly, that some of the statues were carved by a chap called Throp, and I did notice the other day when I was looking for something entirely different that Leonora Cohen's father was a sculptor called Throp, and he died just after the Royal Exchange was completed. So I suspect he may have had a hand in the statuary, but more research needs to be done.
Clearly, it's certainly an interesting topic for further discussion. One of the other points that certainly raised itself in my mind as well was that in the 19th century, there seems to be a great emphasis on creating provision for market trading, if I can use that
yes.
expression. So I suppose temporary, time-limited shopping opportunities in the town centre through markets and market halls and market areas. And then gradually there does seem to be a trend to more ongoing shopping opportunities, so more established shops and
yes.
retail provision. Is that a trend that we can see in terms of the provision that was available in the town centre?
Well, I think one of the things to say is that in the 1890s, there was the Royal Commission on Market Rights and Tolls, which covered the whole country and has, great detail about markets in Leeds, about sort of 30 pages when the commissioners came to discuss the position. Because, the question was, what was the future of market halls in particular? And what they noted very strongly, particularly in the conclusions, was that the north of England was very different to the south of England, and that basically market halls were extremely popular amongst the people of the north, and whereas quite a lot of them had disappeared in the south of England. In fact, of course, when we opened what we call city markets, the 1904 market hall, they're inviting the mayors of all sorts of other towns in Yorkshire, all of whom have market halls. And in fact, one of the embarrassments for Leeds was that, of course, particularly Halifax had a most splendid market hall and Leeds had a tatty one. So, partly they wanted the mayor of Halifax to come over and say, finally, we've caught up with you, but we've exceeded you. But you're quite right. So, but the point is that the habit of trading, market trading and buying in markets persisted to the present day, effectively. And when there was the public inquiry over the council and developers' plans for Kyrgate Market in the 1980s, it was a very tense thing there. In fact, the city council and market and developers, barristers threatened to sue Leeds Civic Trust and bankrupt us if we went in and said what we'd said in our proof of evidence. So it was very tense. But the interesting thing was, in there, part of what was produced in the inspector's report was the quote that I put in my proof of evidence about the fact that in the north of England, people were very attached to their market halls. And he said he didn't want to see Leeds Kyrgate Market destroyed because it was the people's market. And of course, it's tricky now. And okay, of course, we did have the development of shops, department stores, and that sort of thing. But even now, although it's diminished to a significant degree, people really did, right into the 1980s and 1990s, regard the ability to go into Kyrgate Market as hugely important to the city.
Fabulous, a fascinating story, and I'm sure those themes will be picked up subsequently. We've got a few questions around the first White Cloth Hall site and the work that's going on Kyrgate. What is the latest information in terms of what that building is going to be used for, and how does the rear of the site sort of tie in and sort of make sense with the remainder of the site?
Well, I think this is quite a contentious issue in terms of the back of the site. The rear area of the site and the car park at the back is owned by a separate company, City Fusion, I think they're called now, and they've had a variety of ideas for what might be built on that site. You know, there was at one time, going to be a hotel there, which was totally inappropriate. And I think that effectively we have no, and I think there's another scheme which was probably about 3 or 4 years ago for other buildings there, but effectively there's no sign of anything happening there imminently. And frankly, there hasn't been for the last 20 years. As far as the front of the building is concerned, I mean, the idea was, and the building is, the white cloth always designed, hopefully, for people to be able to go out of the back of the building into some other form of maybe shopping right through the Corn Exchange, because of course Rushbond own the Corn Exchange and they own the First White Cloth Hall. So, they have a great interest in linking the two up, and it could be really very good. The uses of the Cloth Hall are debatable at the moment. Effectively, what was effectively the Victorian frontages of the building were retained in the scheme. The idea is perhaps that the 2 wings at the front would become shops. Maybe the covering over the courtyard is hugely important because it greatly improves the economic viability of the building. And you can imagine, a rather nice cafe taking place there. There is at the back of the building, a lift is being put in so people will be able to get to the upper floors. But what I say, just viewing the changes to, the development of this scheme over time, what I found fantastic is that you've been able to see in to the upper stories where you see actually the large volume of the 2 rooms in each of the wings. At times you think, oh, it's a very small building, how could they trade white cloth in there? But when you actually see it, and of course it did have the function of an assembly room for many years, you think, well, how could they dance in there? But actually you realize just how big it is. So I'm very much looking forward to, I was going to have a tour with Jonathan Maud, but unfortunately COVID got in the way. But, very interesting as to, how it works out in the end.
Yeah, and a really positive development given the loss of buildings of that nature over the years. Can
I just say, Richard, I mean, some of the questions are about the abattoir. Now that is a wonderful story, and somebody says, I think it's John Harris talks about how when he was young, and this is where I missed out by only arriving in Leeds in 1969, is that he remembers, seeing bulls escaping from the vicinity of the abattoir and running around, the streets of, sort of Kyrgate, New York Street in particular. And, again, people, obviously the cattle had to get there somewhere. And of course, they were driven into the abattoir. I mean, it's one of those things. Of course, there was a meat market with the abattoir slaughterhouses attached to it. But I do have pictures of the inside of that building because they produce a brilliant brochure showing, all the advantages of the building. So that's good. But as I say, if people do know of other photographs of the buildings that I've described, and particularly interior photographs are hugely valuable and very, very rare.
Yeah, certainly. And again, some of those buildings were hidden places as well, certainly the exchanges, and were known really only to the people who were directly involved in those particular occupations and activities.
Yes, you see, I feel sure that there must be some photographs of the interior of the Royal Exchange, and and it must have been really rather magnificent. And I'm presumably there was a brochure for the opening of it, and probably, unfortunately, not in colour. But of course, there will be people. Well, there's certainly people in the audience who no doubt visited the Tatler cinema in its day, or whether they confessed to popping into Yeats's Wine Lodge for a quick drink, listening to the Wurlitzer organ. Who knows? But it'd be great to hear people's memories of that building.
Mm-hmm. Certainly would. Again, the whole oral history and popular history of those buildings as well. It's very much not just about the bricks and the mortar and the architectural features. It's all of these things which really bring the heritage of these buildings alive and really animate them in a way that just an architectural appreciation really can't do full justice to.
Oh, you see, somebody says their father worked at the Grand Pygmalion after leaving school in 1924. I mean, the Grand Pygmalion was Leeds' first department store, and it was, I'd say, it's just behind me here, isn't it? But it was an absolute sensation in its day when they knocked out the ground floor of 3 linked buildings and put in these, you know, sort of, I don't know, 14-foot high panes of glass in the front. And people had seen nothing like it, you know, and you think, oh, I wish I'd been able to see it.
That perhaps makes a nice link, Kevin, to next week's lecture.
Yes, now, next week's lecture, I have to remind myself, what am I talking about, Richard?
Well, it might just be something to do with the grandest street in Victorian Leeds.
Oh, exactly. Yes, yes. I spend my time just working hard on the history of Hunslet, and then going over for a couple of days, 3 days, to focus on the lecture for the coming week. And yes, Boar Lane. Yes, well, of course, that's it, isn't it? The view behind me. I mean, that is a cracking story, which will go literally from the Middle Ages to the present day in the history of the street. And again, I have some extraordinary and most surprising images of the street before it became the grand street we know today. So yes, I'm looking forward to that myself, since I haven't talked about it for quite a long time now, probably about over a decade, I think, but it's a very good subject.
Fantastic. And perhaps I can share a few photographs of the developing refurbishment work at Holy Trinity Boar Lane as well.
Fantastic, yeah, lovely.
Well, I think on that note, it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Kevin, for another fascinating lecture. Really, I think just scratching the surface of Leeds as a commercial centre. As you said earlier, it really takes the story on a stage from the Leeds as an industrial centre. And it perhaps just gives us a bit of a taste of the shopping and retail treats that we're going to be exploring in the final 2 lectures of the series. So I would like to thank everybody for their attendance at the event as well. Thank you for all of your very interesting comments and your very, very positive feedback. That's a great encouragement to all of us. Thank you to Leeds Civic Trust for organising the event and the terrific practical organisation around bookings and the organisation of the Zoom session as well, which has gone faultlessly. So thank you very much for all of that.
Can I just say, sorry, Richard, can I just say, I know you're too shy to say so, but of course, I think when the email goes out to Martin after this, that there is a little slot which shows where you can donate money to Leeds Minster. I'm very keen on this because, you know, if these were normal lunchtime lectures, we'd have a bucket collection, and of course people don't need to donate now, but if they've enjoyed all 4 lectures, there is the opportunity to do that. And I like to think that part of my effort does go in a way to supporting what is a really important institution in the city. And of course, all the money that's being spent on Holy Trinity Church in renovating it now. So if you're still listening out there, I think we've got 211 people left. Do, if you can, make a donation of some sort to Leeds Minster and Holy Trinity Church.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. And I think that just reinforces Kevin's role in being a champion for Leeds buildings and the Leeds cityscape that we've got and all of that heritage. And I'm sure your lectures and all of your hard work over the last 2 or 3 decades has saved many features and buildings and treasures of the centre of Leeds, which we're able to talk about and enjoy today, and actually see the real buildings for themselves as well. So we look forward to meeting everybody again, same time, same place next week. In the meantime, do leave any final comments on the chat. That's most welcome. We are logging all of the things that you've said, and we will build them into future talks. God bless you. Take care of yourselves, and we look forward to meeting again next week. Thank you all very much.